I want to live to 100 and die making love. 70-year-old billionaire Nelson Rockefeller only achieved the latter, dying mid-affair with his 25-year-old assistant, Megan Marshack. To hide the scandal, she spent a full hour wrestling his dead weight into a suit. But in her panic to cover up this embarrassing death, she made one glaring mistake. She jammed his shoes onto the wrong feet. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was not just a politician, he was a currency. As the grandson of Standard Oil architect John D. Rockefeller, he was born into a reality entirely devoid of friction. If a mountain obstructed a Rockefeller's view, they simply bought the mountain and removed it. He served 4 aggressive terms as governor of New York and later as Gerald Ford's vice president, commanding armies of staff and a vast public relations machine dedicated solely to polishing his myth. By 1979, in a deeply cynical, post-Watergate America hungry for establishment hypocrisy, the 70-year-old Rockefeller presented himself as a dignified elder statesman and patron of the Museum of Modern Art. He preached moral fortitude while settling into a photographed upper-crust domesticity with his wife Happy. But his lifelong insulation forged a fatal weakness, the unshakable conviction that his wealth could alter the physical world. Surrounded his entire existence by fixers whose only job was to sanitize his path, his perception of reality had become dangerously warped. He had lost the basic human instinct for survival, replacing it entirely with an instinct for public relations. Yet the gap between what the public perceived and his inner reality was vast. The public monuments he built were rigid and imposing, but his private life was defined by a reckless pursuit of vitality. The aging lion was terrified of his own irrelevance. The statesman who demanded order from his citizens operated his personal affairs with a dangerous, chaotic arrogance. He maintained secret spaces, physical voids in the map of Manhattan, where the gaze of his wife, the press, and the public could not penetrate. He believed he could compartmentalize his existence flawlessly. He believed he was smart enough and rich enough to live 2 entirely separate lives without the borders ever bleeding into one another. This belief is the core of the tragedy. He engineered a perfect system of privacy, an ironclad bubble of discretion, but a fortress designed to keep the world out also traps the inhabitants inside. When the biological reality of a failing heart finally breached those walls, the very system of secrecy he had spent millions to maintain became a death trap. The silence he had purchased turned lethal. The power that had defined his every waking moment evaporated the second he hit the floor, leaving behind only the panic of those who suddenly realized that $1 billion in the bank cannot restart a human pulse. This frantic, clumsy error became the physical manifestation of an empire crashing violently into reality. Megan Marshack was 25 years old, a young woman navigating the sharp-elbowed, male-dominated world of New York journalism in the late 1970s. She had arrived from California with ambition and a job at the Associated Press radio network, a grinder's position that demanded long hours and offered minimal prestige. The financial chasm separating her reality from Nelson Rockefeller's universe was vast, matched only by the historical and biological abyss between them. He was a man who had helped shape the geopolitical map of the Cold War, while she was a reporter hustling for sound bites on the municipal beat. The collision of these 2 trajectories exposes the absolute transactionality of his power. He saw youth, vitality, and an eager audience of one. She saw an elevator straight to the penthouse of American influence. Almost overnight, the radio reporter vanished, replaced by an official private assistant to the former Vice President of the United States. This title carried a salary of $60,000 a year. Adjusted for inflation, that equates to nearly $250,000 today, handed to a 25-year-old with no prior executive experience, alongside an unsecured loan to purchase a luxurious apartment just steps from his midtown offices. The deployment of this wealth functioned strictly as an instrument of control. The money was a golden leash, binding her entirely to his schedule, his moods, and his secrets. He isolated her from her peers through the sheer overwhelming force of his resources, creating a dynamic where she was utterly dependent on his continued favor. This arrangement was meticulously managed by the invisible army that surrounds men of his stature. The Rockefeller security apparatus, the drivers, the scheduling secretaries, the advance men all knew the reality of the situation. The silence of the entourage remains a terrifying testament to the gravity of his wealth. These were professionals paid to anticipate his every need, including the sanitization of his environment from any moral or reputational hazards. They functioned as a human firewall. When he requested private time, the perimeter was secured, and eyes were instinctively averted. An unwritten rule governed the staff. The patriarch's desires were absolute, and his privacy was inviolable. Aides would meticulously adjust his itinerary to carve out untraceable hours, logging false meetings or vague personal appointments into the official record. The rot at the center of the dynasty thrived in this exact mechanism. The very people tasked with protecting his physical life were conditioned to prioritize his secrets above all else. They enabled the precise conditions that would eventually doom him. By engineering an environment where he was never questioned, never challenged, and never held accountable, they stripped away the safety nets that protect ordinary citizens from their own reckless impulses. He was left completely isolated in a vacuum of his own impunity. And this is where the geography of the scandal becomes crucial. The sanctuary for this orchestrated double life was a discreet, narrow building located at 13 West 54th Street. Viewed from the outside, it presented an unremarkable, slightly austere limestone facade, easily ignored by the thousands of pedestrians marching down the avenue. Inside, it was a custom-built fortress of solitude, owned outright by the Rockefeller family. It served officially as his private office, yet more importantly, it stood as an architectural manifestation of his compartmentalized mind. The townhouse shared a physical wall with the Museum of Modern Art, an institution he had co-founded and heavily bankrolled. A private, highly secure door connected his secret residence directly to the museum's galleries. He could vanish from a heavily photographed public gala, slip through a concealed passageway, and reappear in a private haven devoid of security details or inquiring journalists. The townhouse was filled with priceless modern art, heavy velvet curtains, and an atmosphere of absolute hermetic silence. It was a space specifically designed to be off the grid, a blind spot meticulously carved out of the most scrutinized city on earth. On the evening of January 26, 1979, this blind spot was activated through a practiced, seamless deception. Nelson Rockefeller informed his wife, Happy, that he would be working late at his main offices in Rockefeller Center. The alibi was flawlessly constructed. He claimed to be finalizing the edits on a massive, definitive catalog of his personal art collection. For a man obsessed with his historical footprint, working tirelessly on an art book on a Friday night perfectly aligned with the public image of the dedicated, cultured elder statesman. It was an excuse that demanded absolute respect and forbade any interruption. He weaponized his own legacy to purchase a few hours of illicit freedom. His wife remained at their sprawling Fifth Avenue penthouse, entirely unaware that her husband was navigating the private passage into the townhouse on 54th Street instead of surrounded by art historians. The stage was set, and the physical reality of the room immediately betrayed the fabricated alibi. When investigators eventually breached the perimeter hours later, they encountered a scene that violently contradicted the sterile, organized environment of a scholar at work. The heavy oak desk was strewn with casual debris. Empty and half-eaten cartons of cheap Chinese takeout cluttered the workspace, presenting a stark, pathetic contrast to the billionaire's usual diet of private chefs and exclusive dining rooms. Beside the greasy cartons stood an open bottle of Dom Perignon champagne, its expensive vintage slowly warming in the stagnant air of the townhouse. The room smelled of spilled wine, heavy perfume, and stale food. It carried the pungent, unmistakable aroma of a private indulgence, a setting strictly calibrated for physical intimacy rather than intellectual labor. The sheer banality of the scene, mixing takeout food with luxury champagne, highlighted the desperation of an old man trying to manufacture a casual, youthful evening. Nelson Rockefeller was 70 years old, carrying the immense physical toll of decades in high-stress political combat. His body, despite access to the finest medical care on the planet, was failing. The arteries that had pumped blood through countless political campaigns, through the brutal crackdowns of the Attica prison riots, and through the frantic machinations of his vice presidency, were severely hardening. Yet his ego aggressively refused to acknowledge the biological countdown. He pushed his aging frame with the same ruthless expectation he applied to his employees, demanding it perform tasks and maintain a vigor that was physically impossible. The disconnect between his mental self-image as a virile, unstoppable conqueror and his frail physical reality formed the exact fault line waiting to rupture. He sat in that townhouse drinking champagne, eating salty, grease-heavy food, engaging in the physical and emotional exertions of a secret liaison, completely ignoring the screaming warnings of his own physiology. The true plot twist in this grand narrative lies in the environment he deliberately engineered for that failure to occur. He had systematically stripped away every single layer of protection. He had dismissed his security detail, lied directly to his family, and hidden himself in an architectural vault designed to keep the world locked out. He placed his physical survival entirely in the hands of a 25-year-old radio reporter whose primary qualification was her willingness to be dominated by his wealth. As the clock ticked past 10 p.m., the atmosphere in the townhouse shifted from intimate to lethal. The heavy, warm air became stifling. The physical strain of the evening, combined with his advanced age, the alcohol, and the heavy meal, triggered a catastrophic biological cascade within his chest. The artery snapped shut. The heart muscles, suddenly deprived of oxygen, began to spasm violently. The illusion of absolute control shattered in a fraction of a second, leaving the most powerful man in New York gasping for air on an expensive Persian rug, completely isolated by his own flawless deception. The sudden, terrifying silence that followed his collapse was the loudest sound Megan Marshack had ever heard in her life. One moment she was sharing champagne with the architect of the modern American establishment. The next, she was staring at over 200 pounds of dead weight, rapidly turning a sickening shade of gray. The immediate physical reality of a massive myocardial infarction is brutal and completely devoid of dignity. There is a sudden sharp intake of breath, a clutching of the chest, and the total collapse of the muscular skeletal system. The eyes roll back, the jaw slackens, and the skin instantly loses its warmth, taking on a waxy, unnatural pallor. The towering figure of Nelson Rockefeller, the man who had stared down Soviet premiers and commanded the political machinery of an entire state, was reduced to a heap of failing organs in a matter of seconds. The power dynamic evaporated instantly. His billions, his art collection, his political legacy possessed zero leverage to force his heart to beat one more time. In that precise moment, standing over the dying Titan, Megan Marshack faced a clear binary choice. The obvious human reaction of a person living in the real world is immediate, screaming panic directed at an emergency operator. You find the nearest telephone, you dial 911, and you beg for paramedics to breach the doors and bring their oxygen and their defibrillators. You prioritize the biological survival of the human being on the floor over the reputational survival of the brand. The psychological conditioning of the Rockefeller orbit had infected her completely. She had been indoctrinated into a cult of secrecy where the worst possible outcome was public exposure. The townhouse was supposed to be a fortress, and bringing a screeching ambulance to the front door, shattering the quiet of West 54th Street with flashing red lights, represented an unthinkable breach of protocol. A devastating physical paralysis takes hold when basic survival instincts violently clash with deeply ingrained social conditioning. She stood in the dim light, watching his chest stop moving, her mind consumed by the terrifying optics of the situation. How do you explain the unbuttoned shirt? How do you explain the champagne? How do you explain the simple, devastating fact of her presence in this secret room at this hour? The crisis instantly morphed from a medical emergency into a terrifying political liability. The immense, crushing weight of the Rockefeller name paralyzed her fingers. She was terrified of the very man lying dead at her feet, terrified of his family, of his lawyers, and of the brutal, unforgiving machine that would inevitably crush her for allowing this secret to spill into the streets. She chose to protect the ghost of his reputation rather than the remaining seconds of his life. The minutes began to burn away, each one a catastrophic failure of basic human empathy. The human brain begins to sustain irreversible damage after just 4 minutes without oxygen. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The townhouse remained dead silent. The champagne continued to flatten in the glass. The air grew colder. Every tick of the expensive grandfather clock in the corner drove another nail into the coffin of his survival. He had bought her loyalty. He had bought her silence. And in the end, he had successfully bought his own death. The wealth that was supposed to insulate him from the world had instead created a vacuum that suffocated him. He died exactly as he had lived his final years, hiding behind a closed door, surrounded by expensive objects, desperately trying to manipulate an image that was rapidly falling apart. And this is where the sheer unadulterated madness of the evening truly takes hold. Realizing she could not handle the physical and political weight of the corpse alone, Megan Marshack made a decision that defies all logic and decency. Instead of calling for a doctor, she picked up the phone and called a television host. She dialed the number of her friend, Conchita Pierce, an elegant local media personality who lived in an apartment a short distance away. The phone rang in the quiet of the night, dragging another unsuspecting woman into the epicenter of a historical disaster. "You have to come over," Marshack demanded, her voice tight with a panic that had finally overridden her training, stating that something terrible had happened to Nelson. The arrival of Pierce sealed the fate of everyone involved. The room now contained one dead statesman and two terrified women, trapped in a mausoleum of their own making, about to embark on the most humiliating cover-up in the history of American politics. The tragic death was over, and the grotesque theater was about to begin. The arrival of Conchita Pierce at the townhouse on West 54th Street irrevocably shifted the nature of the crisis. When she pushed through the heavy doors and entered that stifling, chaotic room, she crossed a threshold from which neither woman could ever return. Pierce was a respected television host, a woman whose entire career was built on managing optics, controlling narratives, and presenting a polished surface to the public. She stepped out of the freezing January night and into a nightmare of absolute vulnerability. The scene before her was visually arresting and fundamentally absurd. There lay Nelson Rockefeller, a man whose family name was synonymous with American industrial supremacy, sprawled on the floor, his skin already beginning to take on the terrifying ashen hue of biological cessation. The remnants of the secret evening, the scattered food, the open champagne, framed his massive, inert body. This exact moment was the ultimate test of a psychological conditioning that had infected everyone in his orbit. The obvious human imperative was screaming at them to find a telephone and demand an ambulance. But the instinct that overrode human empathy was the instinct of the courtier. They were staring at a corpse, but they saw a public relations catastrophe. This is the midpoint peak where the true nature of the Rockefeller apparatus reveals itself. The machine was so powerful, so deeply ingrained in the minds of those who served it, that it successfully suspended basic survival logic. Marshack and Pierce did not huddle together to administer effective, sustained life support. They huddled together to assess the reputational damage. Saving his life became secondary. Their absolute priority was managing the public relations fallout on the front page of the morning papers. They recognized instantly that a former vice president found partially clothed in a secret townhouse in the company of a 25-year-old assistant would obliterate a legacy carefully constructed over 7 decades. The decision they made next was born of sheer, unadulterated institutional panic. They resolved to alter the physical reality of the crime scene. They decided to dress him. The sheer grueling physicality of what these two women attempted in that claustrophobic room was a monumental task. Dressing a dead 70-year-old man who carried the heavy, thick frame of an aging politician is an act of desperate preservation. Rigor mortis had not yet set in, meaning his limbs were entirely flaccid, heavy, and unresponsive. They were forced to straddle his inert form, grabbing him by the shoulders, heaving his dead weight upward just to slide a shirt over his arms. Every time they managed to lift his torso, gravity violently pulled him back down against the floor. They were wrestling with a corpse, their own breath ragged and panicked, their hands trembling as they fumbled with the tiny, intricate buttons of his custom-made dress shirt. The air in the room, thick with the smell of stale wine and sudden death, became the suffocating backdrop to an appalling pantomime. Pulling tailored trousers up the legs of an inert 70-year-old man is a brutal mechanical struggle. It requires digging hands under dead weight, lifting hips off the floor, and frantically tugging the fabric upward inch by inch. It is an act that strips away every last shred of human dignity from the deceased. The zipper becomes a terrifying obstacle. The belt becomes a harness they struggle to fasten around a waist that is no longer drawing breath. Nelson Rockefeller had spent his entire life insulated by wealth, untouched by the mundane struggles of ordinary people. He paid people to open his doors, carry his bags, and manage his environment. Now, in his final earthly moment, his body was being aggressively manhandled, pushed, and pulled by two terrified women attempting to shove him back into the restrictive uniform of his public persona. The man who had commanded the political destiny of millions was reduced to a heavy, awkward prop in a desperately improvised theater of deception. The chaos of their efforts inevitably led to catastrophic, glaring errors. In the dim light of the townhouse, their vision blurred by adrenaline and fear, they rushed the final details. They grabbed his expensive leather loafers, desperate to complete the illusion. But they did not retrieve his socks. They jammed his bare feet into the stiff leather shoes. In their frantic haste to finish the job before someone discovered them, they committed the ultimate glaring mistake that would eventually destroy the entire cover-up. They forced his left shoe onto his right foot. They twisted the leather, ignoring the unnatural angle of the ankle, prioritizing speed over accuracy. That single twisted shoe stands as the physical manifestation of their psychological collapse. It was a sloppy, desperate lie forced onto the unyielding truth of a dead body. While they agonized over buttons and zippers, the clock on the wall continued its indifferent march. The human brain requires a constant, uninterrupted flow of oxygenated blood. After 4 minutes without it, brain cells begin to die rapidly. After 10 minutes, irreversible, catastrophic damage is complete. While Marshack and Pierce were treating Rockefeller like a morbid mannequin, whatever faint, microscopic chance he had of resuscitation evaporated completely into the stale air of the townhouse. The 60-minute gap is not just a measurement of time, it is a measurement of absolute moral failure. For an entire hour, they chose the preservation of a political myth over the preservation of a human pulse. The silence in that room was the sound of a dynasty actively choosing its own vanity over the life of its patriarch. As the reality of his permanent stillness finally began to sink in, a secondary wave of panic crashed over them. The dressing charade was complete, but the man was undeniably, irreversibly dead. The coldness of his skin was seeping through the freshly buttoned shirt. At some point during this horrific hour, a sudden, futile attempt at cardiopulmonary resuscitation was made. It was too late, executed with the frantic clumsiness of amateurs who realized their terrible mistake. The chest compressions on a body that had been dead for the better part of an hour produced a grim physiological reaction. The physical pressure forced stomach contents upward, resulting in vomit staining the very clothes they had just fought so hard to arrange, and splashing onto Megan Marshack's own garments. The illusion of a peaceful passing was destroyed by the brutal, messy reality of biological death. The staging had failed. They could no longer hide the violence of his biological collapse. Only then, at 11:16 p.m., a full hour after the vice president's heart had violently stopped, did someone finally reach for the telephone. The call to the emergency dispatcher was terse, anonymous, and entirely devoid of the truth. A female voice simply reported that a man had suffered a heart attack at 13 West 54th Street. She hung up immediately, refusing to provide her name, his name, or the catastrophic delay that had just occurred. The machine was still trying to control the flow of information, feeding the authorities only the absolute bare minimum required to remove the body from their presence. They believed foolishly that the paramedics would simply act as discreet sanitation workers, quietly hauling away the problem without asking inconvenient questions. They fundamentally misunderstood the collision that was about to occur. The arrival of the New York City paramedics introduced an uncontrollable variable into the Rockefeller ecosystem. These were hardened medical professionals, individuals who spent their nights navigating the blood, grit, and violent reality of a city in steep decline. They were not political aides, and they were not intimidated by the addresses they responded to. When they breached the heavy doors of the townhouse, they did not see a dignified statesman who had peacefully slipped away while reading. They walked directly into the aftermath of a bizarre, chaotic struggle. The environment instantly communicated a narrative of deception. The paramedics are trained to assess a scene in seconds, and the scene at West 54th Street screamed of manipulation. The physical condition of the body immediately contradicted the timeline they were being fed. The skin was deeply cyanotic, an aggressive, unnatural blue-gray hue that only develops long after circulation has entirely ceased. The flesh was cool to the touch. These are undeniable biological timestamps. A man who has just collapsed from a sudden heart attack does not look like a man who has been dead on the floor for an hour. The medical professionals instantly recognized that they had been summoned to a staging ground, not a rescue mission. They noted the bizarre state of his clothing. They saw the expensive suit jacket pulled awkwardly over shoulders that were beginning to stiffen. They saw the vomit. And most critically, they saw the expensive leather loafer jammed violently backward onto a bare foot. The clash between the two worlds was immediate and silent. The women, trembling in the background, attempted to project the aura of a tragic sudden medical event, but the paramedics operated on the brutal, undeniable truth of biology. They hooked up their equipment, but it was purely performative protocol. The monitor displayed a flat, unyielding line. There was no life to save. There was only a crime scene to document. The paramedics did their job, loading the massive, heavy body onto a stretcher, preparing to transport the former vice president out of his secret sanctuary and into the glaring, unforgiving lights of the city morgue. They carried him out past the half-eaten Chinese food, past the flat champagne, leaving the two women behind in the sudden, deafening quiet of the empty room. But the plot twist is not just what the paramedics documented in their gritty, factual reports. The true horror of the system reveals itself in the immediate aftermath, when the body was handed over to the authorities, and the family's vast, unyielding public relations apparatus was finally triggered. The women in the townhouse had failed to perfectly stage the body, but they had succeeded in buying enough time for the machine to activate. As the ambulance screamed through the dark streets toward Lenox Hill Hospital, the operatives who managed the Rockefeller empire were abruptly awakened. The machine did not pause to mourn. It instantly shifted into a wartime posture, its singular, ruthless objective being the total suppression of the truth. They were about to launch a massive, coordinated lie to the American public, confident that the power of their wealth could rewrite the messy, humiliating facts recorded by a few city medics. They were about to learn that while money can buy many things, it cannot buy the silence of an autopsy report, and it cannot undo the forensic evidence left behind in the dark. When the emergency room doctors at Lenox Hill Hospital officially pronounced the death of Nelson Rockefeller in the early hours of Saturday morning, a second, entirely different kind of machinery violently jolted to life. This was the legendary Rockefeller public relations apparatus, an institution that had spent nearly a century mastering the dark art of narrative control. Since the days of his grandfather John D. Chuo, who hired pioneer spin doctors to sanitize the family's ruthless corporate monopolies, the fundamental reflex of this dynasty had always been to immediately overwrite reality with a preferred fiction. When the panicked call from the hospital reached Hugh Morrow, the family's longtime, fiercely loyal spokesman, there was no internal debate about transparency. There was no ethical hesitation regarding the public's right to know the circumstances of a former vice president's demise. The machine simply executed its primary directive: protect the brand at the absolute cost of the truth. Morrow, operating under the deeply ingrained assumption that the Rockefeller name possessed the gravitational pull to bend facts, immediately sat down to draft a masterpiece of patrician fiction. The press release issued to the major newswires before dawn was breathtaking in its brazen arrogance. It declared, with the absolute unquestionable authority of the family seal, that Nelson Rockefeller had passed away suddenly at his desk in room 5600 of Rockefeller Center. It explicitly detailed that he had been working late, alone, meticulously reviewing a manuscript about his private art collection. This was a calculated, aggressive fabrication designed to entirely erase the existence of the townhouse on 54th Street, to obliterate the presence of Megan Marshack, and to completely bury the humiliating, lethal 60-minute gap. The arrogance embedded in this strategy is staggering. It relied entirely on a deeply outdated assumption that the police, the medical examiners, and the press corps would simply bow to the family's version of events, accepting the typed statement without a single forensic question. For exactly 4 hours, this manufactured illusion held together. The Saturday morning editions of the nation's newspapers rolled off the physical presses, carrying the official, sanitized obituary. They painted a grand, solemn portrait of a tireless public servant, a man who literally worked himself to death in the noble pursuit of cultural preservation. The irony is sickening when juxtaposed against the grim physical reality left behind in the townhouse. The twisted shoe, the flat champagne, the frantic, amateurish attempts to dress a corpse. The family believed they had successfully hijacked the historical record. They had deployed their immense influence to bleach the crime scene of any unseemly details, confident that their wealth provided an impenetrable shield against public scrutiny. But they had critically misjudged the sociological era they were operating in. This was 1979. The American press had just spent the entire decade aggressively dismantling the Nixon presidency during the Watergate scandal. The deferential, gentlemanly journalism of the 1950s, where reporters actively colluded with politicians to hide their mistresses and medical ailments, had been completely eradicated. It was replaced by a ruthless adversarial skepticism. The Rockefeller machine was attempting to run an outdated playbook against a press corps that was actively hunting for establishment hypocrisy. The fatal flaw in their brilliant cover-up did not emerge from a high-level government leak or a complex journalistic sting operation. It was destroyed by the most mundane, banal piece of civic bureaucracy imaginable. At the headquarters of the Associated Press, a night shift reporter was performing the unglamorous, routine task of reviewing the city's 911 emergency dispatch logs. This is where the sheer arrogance of the billionaire class meets the immovable, indifferent object of public record keeping. The log clearly documented a dispatch for a cardiac arrest involving an elderly male. But the address permanently inked into the police blotter was not room 5600 of Rockefeller Center. The dispatch location was explicitly listed as 13 West 54th Street. It was a simple, undeniable geographical contradiction. A single thread of truth had been found protruding from the flawless tapestry of the official statement, and the press immediately began to pull it with relentless, aggressive force. When reporters initiated the phone calls to Hugh Morrow, confronting the family spokesman with this glaring discrepancy, the entire facade instantly cracked. The machine, caught in a demonstrable, documented lie, was forced into a humiliating, agonizing retreat. By Saturday afternoon, the Rockefeller camp issued its first correction, a grudging, forced admission that the former vice president had actually died at the townhouse. But the instinct to deceive was so deeply entrenched that they immediately replaced the first lie with a second one. They claimed he had been working there with a trusted family security guard. It was a desperate attempt to sanitize the environment, substituting a young female assistant with a stoic male protector. But the press was now swarming the quiet street, interviewing doormen, neighbors, and bystanders. The narrative of the security guard collapsed almost instantly under the weight of eyewitness testimony. The family was forced back to the podium, suffering the ultimate indignity of having their credibility publicly dismantled piece by piece. They were finally forced to release the name of Megan Marshack, admitting that the 70-year-old Titan had died in the exclusive company of a 25-year-old radio reporter. With every forced admission, the dignity of the political dynasty was systematically shredded in real time on national television. The narrative rapidly devolved from a solemn historical passing into a cheap, salacious procedural. The investigative reporters did not stop at identifying Marshack. They dug into the timeline, discovering the terrifying delay. They uncovered the involvement of Conchita Pierce, tracking down the frantic phone call that preceded the call to emergency services. Most devastatingly, the paramedics who had responded to the scene, unbound by the Rockefeller payroll and immune to the family's intimidation tactics, began to speak to the press. They freely described the chaotic, bizarre environment they had walked into. They detailed the deeply cyanotic color of the skin, proving the body had been devoid of oxygen for a prolonged period. They mentioned the vomit staining the clothing. They exposed the absurdly mismatched garments and the expensive shoe shoved violently onto the wrong foot. The 60-minute gap was no longer a secret. It was laid bare, dissected, and broadcasted for the entire public to scrutinize. The exact timeline of the women's panic became the defining subject of American cultural conversation. The public humiliation was absolute and entirely unprecedented for a family of such stature. A bloodline that had spent a century curating an image of philanthropic nobility and stern moral leadership was suddenly reduced to a crude, unavoidable punchline. The cultural verdict was delivered not by a court of law, but by the relentless, mocking machinery of popular culture. Satirical magazines, late-night comedians, and tabloid newspapers eviscerated his memory without mercy. The defining blow came from New York Magazine, a publication that perfectly captured the ruthless, cynical spirit of the city. They published a headline that stripped away every last ounce of his senatorial dignity, printing the brutal epitaph, "Nelson thought he was coming, but he was going." It was a vulgar, devastating summary of his final moments, but it was a verdict earned entirely by the mechanics of the cover-up. Had the handlers and the intimates simply called the ambulance immediately, had they treated the situation with the basic, unvarnished human decency it required, the story would have remained a brief, regrettable scandal of infidelity. Instead, By attempting to manipulate the fundamental truth of his death, they guaranteed that the grotesque, farcical details of his final hour would forever eclipse his 7 decades of monumental public achievement. The immediate aftermath of the scandal presented a jarring, almost hallucinatory contrast between the public rituals of the American elite and the brutal, unvarnished reality of the police reports. While the tabloids were mercilessly dissecting the chaotic 60 Minutes in the townhouse, the Rockefeller family executed a masterclass in institutional denial. They orchestrated a memorial service at Riverside Church in Manhattan that was designed to be an overwhelming display of impenetrable establishment power. The guest list was a staggering assembly of global influence. The President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, sat in the front pews. Former President Gerald Ford, who had selected Rockefeller as his vice president, bowed his head in solemn reverence. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a man whose entire geopolitical career was launched and heavily bankrolled by the Rockefeller fortune, delivered a eulogy that completely ignored the squalid reality of the previous Friday night. Kissinger spoke of Nelson's indomitable spirit, his visionary leadership, and his supposedly unwavering dedication to the American Republic. The church was filled with senators, governors, international diplomats, and titans of Wall Street. They gathered beneath the towering Gothic arches of the cathedral to collectively participate in a massive, coordinated act of historical erasure. More than mourning a man, they were desperately trying to reassert the dignity of their ruling class. The visual of this grand, solemn assembly, juxtaposed against the widely circulated details of that frantic cover-up, was the ultimate manifestation of the establishment's cognitive dissonance. They demanded the public respect a myth that had already been completely dismantled by the physical evidence. While the choir sang and the dignitaries wept in front of the television cameras, a secondary, far more ruthless operation was taking place entirely out of public view. The Rockefeller legal apparatus, an army of the most expensive and aggressive attorneys in New York, mobilized to contain the catastrophic human liability that was Megan Marshack. She had committed the unforgivable sin of surviving the disaster. Her very existence and the intimate knowledge she held of that missing hour represented an existential threat to the family's carefully curated legacy. The true horror of her situation lies in how efficiently she was swallowed by the machine she had tried to serve. The 25-year-old radio reporter, who had briefly enjoyed the intoxicating proximity to the throne, was suddenly subjected to the crushing, overwhelming weight of a billion-dollar legal firewall. The exact mechanisms of her silencing remain hidden behind impenetrable walls of non-disclosure agreements and sealed corporate settlements, but the results were absolute and terrifyingly effective. Megan Marshack did not simply fade from the public eye. She was systematically erased from the cultural narrative by a combination of intense legal pressure and an unforgiving public shaming. She became a permanent exile in the very city she had tried to conquer. The press stalked her relentlessly for a brief period, camping outside the luxury apartment that had once been the symbol of her elevated status. Yet, she never gave the explosive interview. She never wrote the lucrative tell-all memoir that usually follows such spectacular public downfalls. The silence she maintained was absolute, unnatural, and deeply indicative of the threats, implied or explicit, that governed her sudden disappearance. She retreated entirely into the shadows, a young woman permanently frozen in the public imagination as the punchline to a dirty, late-night joke. The psychological burden of carrying that specific silence is immense. For 45 years, she lived with the intimate, visceral memory of watching the architect of the modern American establishment suffocate on the floor, knowing that her own panic and the conditioning of his handlers had sealed his fate. She lived through the entirety of the 1980s, 1990s, and into the new millennium, watching history books document his achievements while society whispered about his degradation. She carried the visceral memory of that 60-minute gap every single day until her own quiet, unnoticed death in October of 2024. The machine ensured that she took the granular details of his final hour to her grave. Her lifelong silence is perhaps the most chilling, enduring testament to the raw, terrifying power of the Rockefeller wealth. They could not save his life, but they successfully purchased her permanent disappearance. The consequences of that January night extended far beyond the personal destruction of a young assistant and the humiliation of a grieving widow. The sudden, farcical demise of Nelson Rockefeller effectively served as the death knell for an entire political ideology in the United States. He was the undisputed champion of the Rockefeller Republican, a powerful, dominant faction of the Republican Party characterized by extreme wealth, East Coast elitism, internationalist foreign policy, and moderate social views. This faction had controlled the levers of American political power for decades, operating from the paneled boardrooms of Manhattan and the grand estates of upstate New York. They viewed themselves as the natural, rightful administrators of the American empire. But the grotesque details of his death severely alienated the rising conservative grassroots movement within the party. The scandal provided undeniable, salacious proof to the emerging moral majority that the East Coast establishment was fundamentally decadent, corrupt, and completely out of touch with traditional American values. The image of the billionaire elites scrambling to cover up an illicit affair while a man died on the floor disgusted the very voters the party needed. Just 1 year after the incident in the townhouse, the Republican Party definitively rejected the Rockefeller legacy, nominating Ronald Reagan for the presidency and permanently shifting the ideological center of the conservative movement westward. The moderate aristocratic wing of the party was effectively eradicated, replaced by a populist, socially conservative platform that viewed the old establishment with deep suspicion. The supreme irony of Nelson Rockefeller's life is that his fatal weakness, his absolute refusal to deny himself any physical or emotional indulgence, and his arrogant belief that his wealth insulated him from moral consequence, ultimately destroyed the very political faction he had spent millions of dollars and decades of his life building. Beyond ruining his personal reputation, the 60-minute gap acted as the catalyst that finalized the collapse of his political empire. The power he wielded so casually in life evaporated entirely, leaving behind a power vacuum that completely reshaped the landscape of late 20th century American politics. Furthermore, the mechanics of the cover-up permanently altered the relationship between the American political class and the journalistic establishment. The clumsy, arrogant lies issued by the Rockefeller public relations machine on the morning after his death destroyed the last remnants of the old gentleman's agreement. For generations, the American press had largely agreed to look away from the private indiscretions of powerful men, treating their health crises and extramarital affairs as off limits. They had protected the paralyzing effects of Franklin Roosevelt's polio and the rampant infidelities of John F. Kennedy. But the brazen, easily disproven fabrications surrounding Rockefeller's death demonstrated to the press corps that they were being actively, maliciously manipulated. When the Associated Press reporter matched the 911 dispatch log against the official family statement, it fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. The press realized that the establishment could not be trusted to report even the basic biological facts of their own existence. The intense forensic scrutiny applied to the townhouse on 54th Street became the new permanent standard for investigative journalism. The aggressive, skeptical media landscape that currently dominates global politics was in many ways forged in the chaotic fallout of those missing 60 minutes. The dynasty's desperate attempt to maintain control over reality actually resulted in the permanent loss of their ability to dictate the narrative. Ultimately, the architectural layout of the townhouse at 13 West 54th Street serves as the perfect physical metaphor for his life and his catastrophic end. It was designed to be a bridge between the respectable, highly curated world of the Museum of Modern Art and the hidden, unrestrained reality of his private desires. It was a structure built specifically to facilitate a double life, funded by a fortune so massive it defied human comprehension. He believed that the walls of that building, reinforced by his name and his bank accounts, could hold back the consequences of his actions. But when the biological imperative of a failing heart struck, the walls did not protect him. They isolated him. The silence of the townhouse, heavily paid for and meticulously maintained, became the instrument of his execution. The handlers, the lawyers, and the young assistant were all paralyzed by the very system of secrecy he had demanded they uphold. The greatest tragedy is that Nelson Rockefeller engineered the exact, precise circumstances of his own undignified demise. He constructed a flawless, impenetrable bubble of privilege, only to discover in his final gasping moments that the bubble contained absolutely no oxygen. The legacy of that night is a brutal, enduring lesson about the absolute limitations of power. The billions of dollars, the 4 terms as governor, the vice presidency, and the towering monuments of marble and steel were utterly powerless against the cold, unyielding reality of a blocked artery and the terrified incompetence of those who valued his myth more than his life. Nelson Rockefeller was inevitably the product of an environment completely devoid of friction or consequences. Raised within the epicenter of an industrial empire, he operated under the absolute conviction that his wealth could alter physical reality itself. He believed he was an institution, and institutions do not suffer heart attacks. They simply issue press releases. His legacy remains a massive unresolved moral debt. On one side of the ledger stand the towering modernist campuses, the civil rights legislation, and the monumental public works that shape 20th century infrastructure. On the other side sits the suffocating weight of the townhouse on 54th Street. He spent a lifetime trying to purchase immortality through architecture and art, only to have his historical footprint permanently defined by 60 minutes of squalid panic. Had Megan Marshack simply dialed for an ambulance the moment he collapsed, the narrative would have been a brief, uncomfortable scandal. Instead, the frantic struggle to dress a corpse and the coordinated campaign of lies transformed a personal failing into a systemic indictment. The millions in his accounts could not bribe a blocked artery, and the terrified loyalty of his entourage could not alter the rigid laws of biology. The saga of the Rockefeller dynasty in the 20th century concludes not with a triumphant political victory, but in a stifling secret room ending with the pathetic, enduring image of an expensive leather shoe forced forever onto the wrong foot.